Hi guys, welcome back. Domain Flow Identity and Access Management. Chapter 4.4, given a scenario, differentiate common account management practice. So this is the last chapter of this domain. So account management practice, we are going to see the three topics here. So general concepts, account types, account policy enforcement. So first we will see general concept. When an employee joins to leave an organization, the process of onboarding, offboarding happens. Onboarding is a process of creating an identity profile and the necessary information required to describe the identity. Onboarding can also include registering the user assets such as computer, mobile device, provisioning them so they can be used to access the corporate network. In BYD, bring your own device cases, many organizations use a self-service method through a pre-configured profile to minimize IT intervention. As part of best practice onboarding procedures, some solutions offer integrations with the Active Directory. This offers a simplified way to identify domain users groups that are permitted to onboard their devices. Offboarding is the opposite process. User identities that no longer requires access to the environment or disabled or deactivate and then deleted from the environment. Based on the organization, it is based on the organization policy. So when an employee is terminated or retires or quits, segregating and retrieving organizational data and application can be difficult if the user's own device are used. BIOD, bring your own device policy, should address how data and corporate owned application will be retrieved during the offboarding process. In some instance, the organization might opt for total device wipe. So least privilege is an access control practice in which a logon is provided only the minimum access to the resource required to perform a task. Remember the phrase less is more when considering security principle. Grant no more access than is necessary to perform assigned tasks. User access reviews. So user access review which allow you to identify misapplied change or other access control adjustment through direct assignment or inherent nesting of rule access rights. In this review, you can find and rectify accidents or malicious attempts to gain unauthorized access rights. Periodic access review, the periodic access review for access management can help ensure the necessary personnel have access to essential systems and unauthorized employee don't. A more formal form of user access review is called as rectifications. Access rectification is typically the responsibility of organization Chief Information Security (CISO), right? Chief Information Security Officer (CISO), because it involves stating that current access adheres to organization's internal policy and compliance regulation. So best practice dictates that access to high-risk applications should be reviewed quarterly and every application have a review conducted at least annually. A baseline must be established to account for normal lines of business operations and be updated regularly to reflect changes in the organization process and software applications. Example including identifying the business owner of every application and classifying the data within applications. These allow you to identify unusual activity and to regularly review all accounts to disable and remove any unneeded credential. Access review should also be conducted for group memberships and role alignment for organization assignment. In this way, you can correct accidental access rights assignment through role and group membership. Users should also be notified of their access rights and the need to alert the IT staffing if their access appears to be greater than allowed by their role. Educations and regular operational control review should be part of organization continuous improvement program to ensure that user comply with the security protections and understanding the requirements demand by both their acceptance and use the data access credentials. Understanding requirement is inherent in any attempt to control data access to conform to those requirements. Technical control must be continuously monitored to protect against violations of policy through purposeful or accidental access. An important best practice is to make sure separations of duties among developers and data custodians and IT administration is well defined and documented. Then the purpose of the condition monitoring is ensure that process for user account provisioning, lifecycle management and terminating are followed and enforcement. So continue monitoring begin with the knowing what user account activity should be presented. So continuously monitored user access enable you to detect unauthorized access from attacker using a system backdoor, averting a wide-scale incident. Industry regulation might require continuous monitoring. For example, PCI DSS compliance requires that an organization have well-defined process in place to review and reassess security practice even in high dynamic business environment. So by default all domain user can log in at any time, many times restricting logon hours is necessary for maintenance purpose. For example, considering the backup runs at 11 p.m. each night. In this case, you might want to be sure that everyone is off the systems. In another example, if database get re-indexed on a nightly basis, you might have to confirm that no one is changing information or locking records during the re-indexing process. So this is also a good way to ensure the hacker is not logging in with a stolen password during off-peak hours. You can restrict logon hours by days of weeks, hours of the day, or both. You can also assign time of day restriction to ensure that employee use computers only during specific hours. So these settings proves useful for organizations when users require supervisions, when security certification requires it, or when employees are mainly temporary or shift workers. So because the employee have more mobile, so organization now often implemented BYOD policy. So location-based policy. Location-based policies allow organization to set policy that permit user to access resource in both organizations and policy personal location settings. So location-based policy or policies based on where a device is located. One example is web filtering policy that prevents inappropriate surfing in the workplace but allow employee to have unrestricted access to web content when they are outside the corporate environment. Okay, so when dealing with the user access, a fine line often existing between sufficient access to get job done and too much access. In these sections, you examine how to manage user access by using group and group policy. Keep the least privilege best practice in mind when comparing access control options. So after that, so when the last one we can see, so when working with the logical control, so two model existing of assigning permissions on rights, so the user based models and role or group based model. So with the user model, the permission are uniquely assigned to each user accounts. So one example of this is a peer-to-peer network or work group in which access is granted based in individual needs. Okay, so let's move on the next slide. Account types. So user account, human users, guest account, shared and generic account, and then changing and names of default systems account. So the access level users are given directly affect the level of network protections you have. You might find it strange to think that you need to protect the network from its own user. However, internal users have the greatest access to the data and therefore the greatest opportunity to either deliberately sabotage it or accidentally delete it. Upon logon, organizations should show a logon banner statement that network access is granted under certain conditions and that activity might be monitored. This helps the organization be sure that legal ramifications are covered and that user can expect it to follow security policy protocol. So IT organizations often use shared account for privileged users, administrators, or applications. So this practice presents security and compliance risk. So one of the first step in providing a secure account access environment is to eliminate the use of shared account. With this account, user cannot be attributed to a particular user credential. So determinants of specific access rights and audit of access use is impossible. Providing each set of access credential to a single principal, either a user or machine service, enable you to measure every use of data access to determine a baseline of expected and acceptable use. So you can then monitor this baseline for variation that indicate potential misuse of enterprise resource of data access. User with administrative functions should not rely on their with a privileged account for everyday use, because an unexpected piece of malware encountered through normally business function runs under the access control restrictions of accessing account. Issuing this user both a common account for normal access and a separate administrative credential set to use when needed limit the span of control for their operational account. Linux users have been doing this for some time, using super sudo, as you know, to perform administrative function from their session account. So certain groups and accounts are installed by default. As an administrator, you should know what these are. Service account often are installed as well. Okay, so for interaction within the operating system. So local service account typically interact with the Windows OS and tend to have difficult password. In dealing with individual account, the administrative account should be used only in administrating the server. Granting user this type of access is disaster waiting to happen. An individual using the administrative account can put a company entire business in jeopardy if he or she accesses a malware infected website or reads the wrong email. In addition, the generic account used by multiple users must be prohibited. By knowing which accounts are installed by default, you can determine which are really needed and which can be disabled to make the system more secure. You should also know which accounts, if any, are installed the blank or well established password. So common machines accounts used in web-based access systems are common target for unauthorized access attempts, particularly when left in default or well-known configuration states. The security settings in many of the newer operating systems do not allow blank password. However, account in older operating system might still have a blank password or well-known default, as well as with the admin logon in older routers. So user rights are applied to the security group to determine what members of the group can do within the scope of the domain or forest. User rights are assigned through the security options that apply to user's account. So default credential and unmonitoring accounts such as guest or admin account commonly established in the older equipments and soften security because they provide one components of access credential to potential attacker or their tools. So replacing a default administrative account named admin within one that uses a more generic or obscure names adds another obstacle. Attacker then must break both account name and associated authentication key. Okay, let's move on next slide. Account policy enforcement. So credential management, group policy, password policy, expiration recovery, and then disablement, locking. The number of systems and users grows in organizations, and account policy enforcement becomes critical. So therefore you should set account policy that define strong security for your systems. Account policy or subsystems of the policy configurable in group policy. Credential must also be assigned for a given time period with an automatic failover to access Daniel if they are not renewed, to ensure that provision account are used and then cease to operate. So this is often necessary in workforce of short-term or temporary workers whose account could otherwise be left intact and unmonitored after the workers rotate to new positions. Such an account presents a target for brute force type of attack on logon password, which can then be spread over a long period of time to avoid detection, intrusion prevention measure. So all credentials, whether the simple logon password or complex encryption keys, should carry a built-in lifetime that ensure their termination even if they are lost or forgotten. So auditing procedure need to reveal long-term inactive accounts and machine account that should be routinely expired and re-established to protect against long-term attack and limit exploitations if they are compromised during the normal period of use. Active Directory domains or group policy object to store a wide variety of configurational information, including a password policy settings. A domain have their own password policy in addition to local password policy. Password policy can control password settings. The account policy settings in group policy are applied at the domain level. The domain account policy settings become the default level account policy settings of any Windows-based computer that is member of the domain. The only exceptions to the rule occurs when another account policy settings is defined for an organizational unit. The account policy settings for OU organizational unit affect the local policy on any computer that the OU contain. Password policy setting for a domain are defined in the root container for the domain. The default domain policy is linked to the root container. It contains a few critical domain wide settings, including the default password policy settings. Of course, a password are one of the best methods of gaining successful access to the service and resource. So password length and duration history and complexity requirements are all important to the security of the network when setting up user account. Take into account proper planning and policies. Passwords are one of the first pieces of information as user enters. Passwords that contain only alphanumerical character are easy to compromise by using publicly available tool. To prevent this, passwords should contain additional characters and meet complexity requirements. So password must meet the complexity requirement policy settings in Windows operating system to determine whether the password meets certain criteria for a strong password. So enabling the policy settings require password to meet the following requirement. So there is local group policy. So you can do it on the local group policy. The password may not contain the user account to full name. The password must contain 3 of the following: uppercase letter, lowercase letter, numbers, non-alphanumerical letter. So these all are the stuff we need to make sure. So when we set up the password. So complexity requirements are enforced when password are changed or created. The policy settings are combined with a minimum password length of 8. Ensure that there are at least a 218, 340 or 105 or 584, 896 different possibility for the single password. This makes a brute force attack difficult but still not impossible. So in the normal course of business, you might sometimes create a domain user account for a short duration. This type of account is useful for contractors or temporary employee. For example, with this kind of the user account should be automatically expire after a specific date. So when the account expires, the user then is no longer allowed to log on the domain. The operating system displays an error message information informing the user that the account has expired. So that is what the expirations. So then account provision policy. For the creation, update and removal of account must be integrated into an organization's HR process and regularly audited to ensure continued compliance. Legacy access groups should be similarly expired when they are no longer appropriate to the organizational operation structure. This helps eliminate the potential avenues of unauthorized access through normal line of business operations. During separations procedure, passwords and other security credentials should be automatically expired to prevent unauthorized access after they are no longer appropriate. So during termination proceeding, this is typical. Coordinate with between managers and IT departments to protect against a terminate employee carry out retributive or expletive actions on organization resources. Okay, so when a user forget a password, two options exist: password recovery or a password reset. Password reset are also performed when a new account is created. Set an initial password. Password requires password recovery. Password recovery and reset can take place in several ways, ranging from an in-person visit with an IT staff member to a fully automated self-service utility. If the identity of the user requests a password recovery or reset is not properly verified, an attacker could easily pose a user and gain access to that user password. All recovery and reset mechanisms should first verify the user identity using methods. Common methods including using predetermined challenge response questions set during account creations, email recovery information, or texting a code to the user's cell phone. Never store passwords or access credentials in an unsecure location or use a reversible form of encryption. Sometimes company wants a list of machines, accounts, or fundamental server recovery administrative passwords. However, the list might end up in the wrong hands if it is not properly secured along with the disaster recovery document. So rename or disable the administrator account or guest account in each domain to prevent attack on your domain. Disable user account as soon as user leaves a company. So these are the very important, like Windows account lockout policy. So everything we can do it in we can audit everything in the local security policy. So the advantage of disabling user account is that all the settings, files and folders of the accounts remain intact. You can then access the information tied to the user account anytime by re-enabling the account. It is good policy to not reuse or rename the account of a terminated users. When a user leaves the organization, the account can simply be disabled and moved if the necessary. Okay, so depending on the company policy, the user account might need to be kept for a certain period of time. For example, some organizations keep disabled account for 90 days and then delete them. The account locked out policy settings help prevent attackers from guessing users' passwords, decrease the likelihood of successful attacks on your network. An account lockout policy disables a user account when an incorrect password is entered a specific numbers of times over a certain time. Account lockout policy settings so an account lockout policy settings it control the threshold for this response and the action taken when the threshold is reached. Account lockout duration policy settings determine the number of minutes that a locked out account remains locked out before it is automatically unlocked. The available range is from 1 through 999 minutes. A lockout duration value of 0 specific that the account will be locked out until an administrator explicitly unlocks it. The lockout threshold can be set to any value from 0 to 999. If the lockout threshold is set to 0, account will not be locked out due to the invalid logon attempts. The reset account lockout counter after policy settings determine the number of minutes that must elapse from the time a user failed to log on before the failed logon attempts counter is reset to 0. If the account lockout threshold is set to a number greater than 0, the reset time must be less than or equal to the value of account lockout duration. So a disadvantage of configuration these settings to restrictively is the user might have to make excessive help desk calls. So this policy stops program from deciphering the password on locked account by repeated brute force attempts. The maximum password age policy setting determines the number of days that a password can use before the system requires the user to change it. You can set password to expire after any number of days between 1 and 999, or you can specify the password never expires by setting the number of days to 0. So the Microsoft operating system password age policy settings determine the number of days that password can used before the before the system requires the user to change it. So if the maximum password age is set, the minimum password age must be less than the maximum password age. So when the maximum password age is set to 0, the minimum password age can be any value between 0 and 998 days. So good policy is to set the maximum password age to value between 30 and 90 days depending on your environments. So try to expect the password between major business cycle to prevent work loss. Configure minimum password age so that you don't allow password to be changed immediately. So this way an attacker has a limited amount of time in which to compromise a user password, gain access to your network resource. So password resource is an important concern in any organization. When allow user tend to reuse the same password over a long period of time, the longer the same password is used for particular account, the greater the chance the attacker will be able to determine the password through the brute force attack. Allowing user to reuse the old password greatly reduce the effectiveness of the good password policy. Most operating systems have settings that don't allow user to reuse the password for a certain length of the time or certain number of password changes. The enforced password history policy settings in Windows operating system determine the number of unique new password that must be associated with the user account before an old password can be reused. Specifying a low number for these settings allow user to continuously use the same small number of passwords repeatedly. Configuring the server to not allow user to use the same password this way Setting the enforced password history settings to 24 helps mitigate vulnerabilities caused by password reuse. Making the password length at least 8 characters and a recurring combination of uppercase and lowercase letters, numbers and special characters is good practice. In Windows operating system, the minimum password length policy settings determine the length number of characters that can make up a password for a user account. You can set a value of between 1 and 14 character, or you can establish that no password is required by setting number of character to 0. In most environments, an 8-character password to recommended because it is a long enough to provide adequate security but still short enough for user to easily remember it. But the 21 character is one of the best good practice for the when you talk about the security posture. So adding complexity requirement helps reduce the possibility of a directory attack. Although longer passwords are more effective against attacks require long password can cause account lockout from mistyping can actually decrease the security of organization, because user might more likely to write down their password. User educations on the proper way to making long password that they can easily remember is the best solution. So require user to change password every 90 to 180 days depending on how secure environment environment needs to be. So remember, the more often users are required to change password, the greater the chance they will write them down, potentially exposing them to unauthorized users. Okay, so we go to the next slide. Linux password policies. Yeah, so exam preparations. John is a database administrator for his organization. He is setting up a new Microsoft SQL Server system and needs to establish an account for it. Which of the following would be best type of the account for the use? Answer A, service account. Answer is service account. What is the second one? The exam preparation. So what is the name of the annual auditing process whereby you determine if given account continue to require a set of privileges? Answer is C, rectifications. Okay, so that's it guys for this video. So I will post the practice lab and later on video. So just play around with the practice lab. So the more you play with the practice lab on you just create the practice lab and just play around with that stuff so you guys can understand very easily. Okay, so that's it guys. Please subscribe my channel, press the bell button, share the video if you like. Thank you, have a good day, bye bye.